I don't know how you want us to proceed. So what I've done is I put together I think there's about 8 or 9 slides or something, but I don't really want to give a lecture to you all. What I want to do is give you the chance to ask me questions, particularly because it's also always really informative for me and then for the guys who work with me to hear about what concerns all of you and what we could be doing. So. Um, but but I'm also would like to invite anyone to chip in and stop me or ask me while I'm presenting if there's anything that isn't clear at all, because it's always difficult to know exactly what level everybody wants the information at. So, do you want to? I'll just hand back for a minute if you want to sort of kick things off or say anything before I start talking.
Yeah, well, maybe we can start with if anyone has any questions to start or anything you really want covered. Um,
Kate, sorry. Hi, this is Andra. Justin, thank you so much. Kate or Sharon, it would be great. I don't think everybody knows Justin. We're so familiar with Justin. So it would be wonderful if you want to, Kate, introduce Justin and talk about why we decided to do basic science as a lunch and learn.
yeah. Um, well, Sharon, do you want to start really quickly?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Justin, for being here. Justin is a professor at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and he leads research in the focusing on the role of adipose tissue in health and disease. He works on dysfunctional fat tissue conditions, such as type 2 diabetes, metabolic issues, liver disease, and of course, lipodystrophy. Justin gave us an amazing lecture back at November at the symposium, and he was really interested in hearing our community and our thoughts and needs, and he really wanted to connect with us. The reason we wanted him to speak a little bit about basic science is because basic science is not that basic. Um, we like to call it fundamental science or fundamental research. And Justin will explain a little bit what it is and why it's important. Um, did I forget something, Justin? Do you want to add something to the introduction?
No, that sounds perfect, Sharon. I mean, I'll introduce myself a little bit as well. I'll try and cover that. Um, before I forget to say before I forget to say this later. So really happy to take questions as we go along or at the end. I'm hoping for a lot of discussion at the end. I don't have that much to say. And also, if you think of things afterwards, we're always really happy to hear afterwards. If there's things I don't cover today, but you'd be really interested in, I'd be really happy to come and do this again. So yeah, hopefully you might want me to do it again. We'll see. We'll see what you
Yeah.
all think. So, so shall I kick off? So, thanks very much, Sharon, for that very, very nice introduction. So I think you've covered the fact that, so I run a research lab at the Rowett Institute, which is at the University of Aberdeen. So I'm going to try to tell you a bit about what we do. What I think I'll try and cover what I think basic science can do or fundamental science can do. But obviously we want to know what you think fundamental science should be doing as well. So for those who don't know, those who were there in November will have seen this before. This is just me showing you that if you don't know where Aberdeen is, more people tend to know where Edinburgh is in Scotland. So this is in the north of the UK, and Aberdeen's just a bit further north. So we're sort of up with probably one of the northernmost cities in the UK, and it's very nice, very beautiful here, and that's the old University of Aberdeen. We work in this new building, which is research institute, which is dedicated to a mixture of fundamental science, a lot of nutrition research, which I'm really interested in, and I'll come back to that hopefully at the end if I remember. So I'm based here in the Rowett Institute. So I'm going to be looking to my left, and that's just because that's where my slides are, so I can see what they are. So we do a mixture of things in my research lab. And so I guess what I consider fundamental science to be about is just trying to really understand what's behind the problem in lipodystrophy, And that overall, the idea or the pitch that I would make to funders is that if we can understand exactly what's going wrong, exactly why having altered fat tissue function, which is essentially what's at the core of lipodystrophy as we understand it, why that causes all the things that patients suffer from. If we can understand all in detail about how that occurs, we might be able to make better medicines, and we might be able to understand how the medicines that we already have work, and that'll improve things. We might be able to suggest better ways to treat the condition. And I'll come to this later, but obviously I think one of the really important things is to identify the things that we're not doing well at the moment. So we do a mixture of things, and right at the most fundamental end are studies looking at the molecules, the proteins within cells that actually do the job of making a fat cell function properly. And so we do a whole bunch of experiments using particularly human fat cells, which we grow in culture dishes, and we manipulate those cells, change the things that they're doing to try and understand more about how fat cells form and what the biological functions of fat cells are, and why, when they don't work properly, you get all the things that we see in patients with lipodystrophies. So that's at the very fundamental end, which is at the sort of left-hand side of this slide. We do what we call preclinical studies, which is where we're not trying to do clinical experiments. We're trying to understand still mechanisms of what's going on. And we often do those, or we can do those in animal models, and particularly in mouse models, just because there's so much information about different processes that go on in the physiology of the mouse, which we know replicates quite well the physiology of humans for certain things. And so we can use those preclinical models to either understand more about mechanisms that are going on in disease, or to test drugs or new therapies that we couldn't do in patients either, because it wouldn't be ethical, or it wouldn't, it would just be too challenging to try and do. Really, to know that before we try and do anything in a patient and try and help any patients, that we actually know we're on the right track, or we can identify any side effects or any problems with things that we think could be helpful. So that's quite a lot of what I'm interested in doing at the moment. And I've just noted here that one of the reasons these preclinical studies, these studies in mice, can be really helpful is that we have, in my lab, particularly we use this mouse model of a generalized lipodystrophy, congenital generalized lipodystrophy type 2, and the mice actually have many of the same problems that you would find in patients with congenital generalized lipodystrophy type 2. So I would argue they're a very good model in which to do these types of experiments and to test therapies and to test what's going wrong. And I've listed some of those things in green. Those mice they're resistant to the actions of insulin, so insulin doesn't control blood sugar properly in that mouse model in a very similar way. The mice have fatty liver, they have increased hunger, just like patients with generalized lipodystrophy. They have actually some joint problems we've done some studies on more recently, and some heart problems. I've just highlighted in red the fact that things are never perfect. In fact, these mice don't have very high circulating levels of fat within the blood, which is definitely a feature of the human condition, and isn't modeled, as it turns out, in those mice. So but they are very useful for many things. And so, just as an example, some of the things that we're really interested in studying at the moment, and I know that Sharon was very helpful. I think we possibly others of you as well, in commenting on an application for a grant that we're just putting in at the moment to try and understand more about how these GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs might work in lipodystrophy. So one of the things we're really interested in is how do GLP-1 receptor agonist drugs. So these are things like Ozempic, Mounjaro, these drugs I'm sure you'll all have heard of. And how they actually work in lipodystrophy, we know a lot less about than how they work in common type 2 diabetes or how they work in obesity. And so that's one of the things we're really interested in at the moment. We have some work, I'm not going to talk about in detail any of this, but anyone who was there at the meeting in November, we've been doing some studies with a colleague of mine, George McElroy, who has his own lab studying lipodystrophy in Aberdeen, where we're trying to do gene therapy approaches. So we're using viruses to give back the sort of dysfunctional gene to try and sort of repair fat cell function using this model, and that looks actually really encouraging. We think that's working very well. So there's a fair way to go before that could be a therapy in patients, but we think it's really encouraging what we're seeing. And so we're not only trying to replace the gene, which is defective in the developing fat cell in this particular model. We've also done some work where we've tried to give leptin, so that instead of doing daily injections of leptin, one might be able to use a virus to deliver leptin as a gene therapy so that you can replace the leptin without the need for daily injections. So that's another thing that we've been looking into. So those are the kinds of studies that we can do and that we are doing at the moment. And then obviously then back to the more fundamental end, we're trying to understand, exactly what causes lipodystrophies, what goes wrong in the fat cells that makes them dysfunctional, and then how does that lead to all the other conditions that you see when you have lipodystrophy? Why does it affect all these other tissues in the body and all these other organs, and what goes on? And the more fundamental end of that research is trying to understand the condition, but also, we would hope, identify new targets. So new processes that we didn't realize were going wrong in those cells, which we might be able to manipulate with new therapies. Okay, so hopefully that's all. Is that I've probably said more than I thought to that slide, but is that good? No questions so far. Is that about the right level? I'll see some nodding people, or are we good? Okay, excellent. So again, some of you may have seen this in November, but I think the key question for me is, what is it we need to know about lipodystrophies that we don't know already? And then also, I'll say something a bit more about the approaches that we can use. But one of the things that I think I hear from meetings like the one in November and many before is that one of the real challenges is the kind of multi-system aspects to lipodystrophy. So it's not, I think a lot of the research, certainly a lot of the research when I started working in this area, is all about controlling blood sugar levels, controlling blood fat levels, how much, how much sugar and fat is circulating. So very much focusing on the diabetes side of things, but not so much on all the other things which we know affect patients with the condition. So, I've highlighted a few things there, but there are many other aspects of lipodystrophy that I think are poorly studied, and I think trying to understand more about why having dysfunctional fat affects those processes is really important, and that's one of the things that I think we could certainly be doing more about. And so I think I won't necessarily go through the right-hand side of this slide. I think it's basically what I just told you with the last slide, is that in these sort of preclinical models we use, these mouse models, we're able to both dissect some of the mechanisms of what's going on in the condition, but also test some novel therapeutics. But there are, of course, some limitations to this. One of the particular limitations actually is that we don't really have any good mouse models of partial lipodystrophies. Obviously affect far more people than generalized lipodystrophies, and yet we don't really have an accurate mouse model of those conditions, and so that's a bit challenging. And then there are some differences between mouse and human physiology, as you might imagine, not least the fact that mice are running around on four legs with fur and whiskers, and so you can't say that everything you see is going to be directly translatable. So we have to always be really, really alive to that problem. And then obviously there are some things that we really just can't test, or we can test in some ways, but it's very imperfect. So things about mood, anxiety, chronic pain, things that are quite hard to test in animal models. We can't ask mice how they feel or whether they think that things are improving for them. So there are some real challenges there. So that's sort of my effort to try and tell you a bit about what we're trying to do, and an overview of the kind of research we do. I've got a couple of slides which really are trying to cover the importance of fat, because I guess the key question is, from the fundamental science side, you might well ask, or when I speak to people I know or students I'm teaching, I think the first key question is, why does it matter if your fat tissue isn't working properly? I mean, most people spend their time trying to lose fat. So is it useful for me to say a little bit about that? That's sort of fundamentally why fat tissue is important and
Yes,
what
definitely.
it's doing for everybody. Because I think that's really at the heart of the fundamental side of what's going wrong in lipodystrophy. So I'll apologize. The first thing I'm going to say is about obesity, and that's because I think it sets the scene for how we might be able to better sell this to people who are going to fund the work that we're really interested in.
Sorry,
So,
Justin, can you also explain the difference between partial and generalized lipodystrophy as you do this?
oh, certainly.
There was a
Yes.
thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Kate. So here is an MRI scan, which you might be familiar on the left-hand side there of a healthy individual. So what you're looking at is a full body scan of someone, and using this magnetic resonance imaging, we don't need to care about how that works. And this particular method, fat tissue shows up in white. And you can see there a completely what we would consider a sort of healthy distribution of fat in a female body shape, which is, you can see there lots of fat around the hips, which is really important. I'm going to come back to this later. Lots of fat around the hips and under the skin. You're not seeing a lot of white anywhere else, okay? And that's really healthy, a healthy distribution. And what happens is when you eat normally, if you have a bit too much nutrition, what should happen is that those nutrients, particularly fat, but in some ways sugar as well, get safely stored away into fat tissue. And that's fat tissue's job in life, not just for us, but for everything down to, all mammals. That what you want to do is to store energy, and you want to do that safely, because fat isn't very good for lots of different cells, but fat cells within fat tissue have spent their time evolving to be very specialized in storing fat. And they do that really well. And what they do actually is they put it into one big globule of fat, a fat droplet in the middle of the cell. And that can get really big and really small. And it just keeps that fat away from everything else. And so the idea is that the fat tissue will expand a bit, store the fat safely, and then when you need some energy later, this is particularly evolutionarily, if you have to go several days without food, you can use that stored energy for all your energy. And the really important thing is the reason that we bother having fat instead of storing it some other way is it's really energy dense. It's a very, very good way of storing energy. And that's actually also why eating fat tends to, people tends to be considered bad for you in a way if you're trying to limit calories. There's a lot of calories for each gram of fat versus other things. So what happens? If you get too much, you overdo this, then obviously you can develop obesity. And this is an MRI scan of someone with quite significant obesity. And what you can see is they no longer just have fat tissue around the thighs. These white areas have actually started to get it in lots of other places. And most importantly, I'm not sure if people can see any sort of, can you see a pointer on the screen? I'm just trying to see if I've got a.
Yeah, I could see the pointer for a second.
Yes, right.
Can you see it there?
I see it.
Over the middle of the obesity image. So you can see actually there's a lot of white there right in the middle of this individual. That means it's the fat has accumulated around the organs. So it is fat tissue. It's still fat tissue. It's not just fat accumulating, but that fat tissue really shouldn't be there. And we know that that's really unhealthy if you start to accumulate fat tissue there. And what happens is it's not actually the fat tissue in many ways that's causing the problem. The problem is you expand the fat tissue to a limit, and then it really just can't store anymore. And it flows over into other tissues. And that's really when you start to get a problem with in obesity or in any individual. And what happens is the fat starts to accumulate elsewhere. And I'll highlight a couple of places. One in particular is the liver. You start to get fat accumulating in the liver. And because the liver is really important in controlling blood sugar levels, because you stop it working properly because it's now filled up with fat, you start to get really poor blood sugar control. You get fat accumulating inside the cells in the pancreas. I don't know if you know, the pancreas is this organ which normally, when your blood sugar levels go up, the pancreas will release this hormone called insulin, which works on other cells to make them take up sugar, and then the sugar's no longer in the blood and your blood sugar levels drop again. So insulin is this critical hormone that regulates blood sugar levels. And that process of these cells secreting or releasing this insulin to control blood sugar levels, that starts to go wrong if those cells in the pancreas, which would normally release the insulin, start to accumulate fat. And we also have problems in muscle. Muscle tends to be a key place where the blood sugar gets stored when you're lowering blood sugar levels. And again, that all goes wrong if you start to get fat accumulating in the muscle. And then finally, I also just mentioned that I think lots of people will know that if you have lots of circulating fats in your blood, you can start to get these deposits in your blood vessels, and it starts to cause cardiovascular disease, or problems with your blood vessels effectively kind of furring up with fat, and it causes problems with circulation. So these are all problems really caused by the fact that you'd overfilled the fat and it can't store any more fat safely where it should be. Does that make sense? Right. So obesity in many ways isn't a problem of having too much fat tissue. It's the fact that you've gone as far as you can expanding the fat tissue and you started putting it somewhere else. Okay, so this hopefully neatly leads me to what happens in lipodystrophy, because you can imagine in most forms of lipodystrophy, actually, effectively what we think is happening is you have this restriction on the ability to store fats safely away into fat tissue, but a much lower BMI than you would see in a healthy individual. And in fact, obviously in a much lower BMI than you'd see in an overweight individual. So there's some problem in the ability to expand the fat tissue safely and store this fat safely. So even though, and this is a patient with generalized lipodystrophy, which will lead me, Kate, in a moment to explain about the different types, is that they effectively have no body fat or almost no body fat, but they can't make any. So now, as soon as there's any fat in the system, that fat's going to all the wrong places. It's going to all the organs that cause problems, going to the liver, going to those cells which would normally be controlling insulin release and blood sugar levels, or into the muscle or into the blood vessels. So hopefully that explains sort of why what's slightly, I would say, counterintuitive when you first start looking at this is that you have people with obesity who have lots and lots of fat tissue everywhere, and you have people with lipodystrophy, in some cases with almost no fat tissue anywhere, and yet they have many of the same symptoms, in the sense that, in terms of diabetes, at least in terms of fatty liver, and it's because the fat has gone to the wrong place.
This is Andra. Since you offered, I'm going to jump in.
Please do.
Now, and I don't want to get too detailed on this, but it's true. We're learning, as we learn about obesity and fat cells, we don't quite understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we don't quite understand it. But some people can look obese, but actually their fat cells are growing well and storing the fat they need, right? So not everyone who's on the outside, what we might consider obese or very heavy, has these challenges with fat growing around their organs. And we don't quite understand that. Am I right?
No, you're absolutely right. And actually, I'm going to come to something related to that in a minute, actually. But it is a really important, or at least it leads to a really important point. I think you make a really important point that that almost everybody is different, actually. And so you can have people, it's exactly what you're describing, what we would refer to as metabolically healthy obese or metabolically healthy overweight individuals, where you can actually have lots and lots of fat tissue. You would measure, BMI, for example, and say, oh, this person's overweight, they ought to be unhealthy. And actually, they're perfectly healthy. And we believe it's because, just as you say, they're still making perfectly healthy fat cells. They're making more of them. So then they're fine, because they're still trapping the fat nice and safely in expanding fat tissue. And so there's no negative consequence. There will be some consequences for sort of stress on the joints and other organs and things, but they're not getting type 2 diabetes, for example. So it's absolutely the case. And the real challenge is that that's different for different people. So one person might reach a BMI of 23 or something, which is not remarkable, perfectly reasonable weight to be or size to be, and yet can have, start to develop type 2 diabetes. Someone else could be very, very overweight and not have diabetes at all. And it's probably, at least in part, because the person who's more overweight still has the capacity to store more fat if they need to. And that's what we think links all of these conditions to lipodystrophy, because we think it's the same thing that's happening in lipodystrophy. It's just that the body fat amount at which those problems occur is typically lower in individuals with lipodystrophy. Obviously, in partial lipodystrophy, this is a little bit more complicated, and hopefully it'll become a bit clearer on the next slide or two. So, but I will say, is that good, Andrew? Is that to answer that in a bit more detail?
Exactly. That's
cool.
And I didn't want to make it more complicated, but I thought that might be an interesting point.
Don't worry, that's what I'm here for. So, no, so I think then just to make the distinction now, but I think it may be on the next slide anyway. So in generalized lipodystrophy, we call that generalized lipodystrophy because, as the description suggests, the fat tissue is reduced everywhere. It doesn't matter where in the body, the fat tissue. In the more severe cases, I guess, the very, very significant generalized lipodystrophy, there could be almost no fat tissue anywhere. In partial lipodystrophy, you can actually have very substantial amounts of fat tissue. As I'll explain in a minute, I don't think it even necessarily has to be sort of in the wrong place, if you imagine that as a description. But certainly that there's a reduced fat tissue in some places. And I think it's probably more accurate to describe it as having a dysfunction of fat tissue, because I think certainly in some cases, the distribution of where the fat is in the body can be really only very subtly different from what you would expect in a healthy individual. So, and that's really, I think, one of the challenges probably as well, is understanding why that is. But also it makes diagnosis, as I understand it, very challenging in some circumstances. Now, which actually reminds me of something I should have said at the beginning. So I am a science researcher. I am not a clinician, so I also just thought I ought to put that out there before anyone starts asking me any questions at the end. I'm not a medical doctor, so I think it's really important for me to make that clear, so that you take what I'm telling you with the right view, that I'm not dispensing medical advice, because I'm not qualified to do so. But obviously, I'm very interested in trying to make sure that we can give medical doctors the information they need, or help them to do their job better. So, but yeah, so partial lipodystrophies can be really subtle changes in fat distribution. Right. So I think I'll try not to linger too much on this, because again, I think I've covered some of this already, but it's really just to say that point, which is it's one second, let me just get rid of. Okay, so which is how can the fat tissue be affecting so many things? Because what I think most of you will know well is that you don't feel like you have a condition which is just affecting fat tissue. It's affecting lots of things in your lives. And how can the fat be doing this? Well, that's because all the things are linked, and because the fat tissue is so important in appropriately controlling how fat in the body is stored, and the negative effects if that fat goes somewhere else, because the fat can have such negative effects on so many different tissues and so many different organs, then that's where a lot of the complications come from, is the fat acting in those other tissues and organs, causing this kind of multi-system disorder. And I've just highlighted a few things there, but that we know that you can have problems in the joints. One of the big things is, which I'll come back to, is the regulation of appetite. The fat tissue plays a really important role in the regulation of appetite, not just by controlling blood sugar levels and blood fat levels, but also by regulating hormones, which I'll come to. So this just gives you is just to try and make that point about fat tissue talking to all these other organs, and that's why it's effectively a multi-system disorder. It's because of the kind of reach of the fat tissue. So one of the things we're really interested in is understanding exactly how this poor fat tissue function influences all these other tissues and causes all of these other problems. So this basically comes back to Andrea's point then, is that, you know, you could ask the question, well, many people living with lipodystrophy have fat tissue, so why isn't that fat tissue enough? And I think I've probably already now said quite a bit about that, but I will make the point that there are different levels of complexity to this. So I guess if you went back 15 years or something, people would say, oh, fat tissue is maybe a bit more than 15 years. I've been doing this for longer than I probably should say. But anyway, you know, it's not that long ago people would have said, well, fat tissue is fat tissue, right? It's just these cells, which we know are very good at storing fat. They've got this big lipid droplet in the middle of the cell, and they don't do anything else really. They're useful padding in the body. They're useful for insulation, and we know they store energy. But they don't really do much else, and they're all the same. They all look the same. They must be the same. What we now know is that where those fat cells are in the body, where that fat tissue is, actually is really important to its function. So I've highlighted a few things on this little image on the right hand side, but really just to say that, you know, we have fat in lots of different places, and it's not all doing the same stuff. It's not all doing the same thing. And I'll just pick out a couple. So, you know, we know, for example, I mentioned before, what I'm trying to show over here in the green, if you can see the pointer. So the fat around the thighs under the skin and on the buttocks under the skin. So I would say, you know, is actually very healthy fat, effectively, in most individuals. So it's good for you and gives you somewhere comfy to sit down. That's what we always say. So it's nice, healthy fat tissue. And I would argue, actually, I'm not too sure you couldn't argue that that's the stuff that humans evolved to have, that really that's probably could be really the only fat tissue in any large amount we were meant to walk around with, because we know that if you expand that fat, it doesn't seem to cause you any problems in terms of diabetes or anything like that. Okay, if you just expand that fat. So that's what we always think of as healthy fat. Then you get fat accumulating under the skin in the upper body. So particularly if you think around the belly area, that fat that's under the skin there, it's still not that bad, but it's not as good as the stuff in the lower body. Okay, it's just in terms of as an observation about which stuff it's healthy to have and which it's not healthy to have. And then you start to get the fat which accumulates around the organs, which is in the middle here in pink. And that's the stuff which we know is quite unhealthy to have. And it tends to be, if you expand that depot, those accumulations of fat, they're what are linked to poor health. Okay, and I'll also just make the point, and this isn't necessarily just a point about lipodystrophy. This is about actually it's probably more relevant to obesity, but just for interest, the fact that when you increase your body fat mass, what tends to happen is you start increasing the stuff in the lower body, the healthy stuff. Then you start increasing the stuff under the skin in the upper body. Then you start increasing the stuff around the organs. And finally, when you've filled that up, you start to put the stuff into your liver. You start to put the fat into your liver. And what I always say about people losing weight and trying to get healthier is the good news is that if you can lose weight, if you can reduce your body fat, then the fat tends to go from the worst places first. So you lose it in reverse order. So that's more a point for you know, when people are overweight, but I think it's probably also, I suspect it may be true in lipodystrophy as well, that if you can, or if we could therapeutically give back some healthy fat mass, we would probably start taking the fat out of the bad places first, I would predict. So it's more, in lipodystrophy, that's more a point about what I think might happen if we had effective therapies, is that you probably would start to reduce the liver fat before you started removing anything else, for example. Okay, so So I make that point that there are different places where fat is, and those different places influence how bad that fat is for you. But what makes things really complicated is that we now know that if you just take any one particular depot of fat, and I'm going to give, for example, here this fat that's just under the skin in the upper body, because there were some very nice studies with this recently from using fat collected from people, is that this is what fat tissue looks like. So if you've never seen it before, this is a slice through fat taken in an image taken on a microscope, and each one of these little round circles is a cell, a fat cell, and you can't really see anything because that fat cell is a thin layer of everything the cell needs around one big fat droplet. And that's what you're looking at. So each one of these things is effectively a fat droplet with a thin skin of a cell around the outside of it, with all the things that cells need packed into that thin shell around the outside. So it's a bit like thinking of an egg, and all the stuff the cell does is in the shell of the egg, and all the thing inside the shell is a fat droplet. Okay, now what we know now is that if you characterize those cells individually, and I'd be happy to try and describe how this is done, but I won't do it immediately now, is you can look at, what genes are switched on in those cells. You can look at what proteins those cells are making, what machinery they have in them, what processes they're capable of. And what we find is that they might all look very similar, but they're actually different. So they're all storing fat in a big droplet, but exactly what else they have in the cell differs from cell to cell. And there could be up to, or certainly we know there are at least 3 different types of distinct fat cells within this one particular fat from one region. They're not in little clusters; they're scattered completely amongst each other in this section of fat. And we know that some of those cells have really active fat turnover, so they're storing fat and then they're releasing fat and then they're storing fat and then they're releasing fat, and they're healthy. We know that they've got healthy properties. And right next to them will be a cell that's storing fat and then it's not letting it go, and it's just sitting there doing nothing. And that's an unhealthy fat cell. And we also know, I'm going to tell you in a second, about there are some hormones that fat cells release. So I bet many of you will know about leptin, because leptin is the classic example of a hormone that's released by fat cells. And we know that leptin is really important in regulating appetite and other aspects of health. And so that's why in lipodystrophy, often if patients have very low levels of leptin replacement therapy can be helpful. So it's because the hormone is effectively very low because the fat tissue is low. And we happen to know that the amount of leptin that's expressed in some of these cells differs from other cells with other levels of hormones in them. So so this is what we call those fat cell hormones we call adipokines. So it's just a word for fat cell hormones, basically. And there's a positive profile of different hormones in the good cells, and there's a negative profile of hormones coming from bad cells. Now, so this is where I get into a bit of speculation, because we haven't really demonstrated this, but I bet it's going to prove to be true, is that what happens in lipodystrophy is you can have fat, but you've got 2 levels at which it might not be working properly. Firstly, it might be in the wrong place, so that it's in a depot, and we know this already, that in partial lipodystrophies, you tend to see fat accumulating, centrally or in the upper body, and you tend to lose often the subcutaneous fat under the skin, the fat under the skin, and particularly fat under the skin in the lower body. And we know that that's the healthy stuff. So it makes sense that, that would be worse for you than losing fat from a different area, or accumulating fat in the bad places is going to be worse for you than accumulating it in what we might consider good places. But what is almost certainly going to prove to be true as well is that even where you have fat, that fat, I suspect, will have this poor profile of being unhealthy fat cells. So even if they're the same size, they look the same, you'll have more of the cells which are not doing things in the best way. They're not taking up fat and releasing fat and taking up fat and releasing fat. They're just holding on to it, and they're not releasing the good fat hormones. They're releasing bad fat hormones. So that just brings me to say, that just highlight the fact that leptin is one of these hormones that comes from fat tissue, and that we know is a really useful treatment for lipodystrophy, or certainly in some cases of lipodystrophy where leptin levels are low. If you don't have leptin, or if you could use more leptin, if you could usefully sense more leptin, having more leptin can be therapeutically helpful. And that's one of the really key ways that fat tissue can also regulate health. Okay, so I see that I've spoken for longer than I was predicting, but I got one more. This is the last slide, I promise, which is just to say, I'm really interested to hear your questions and hopefully answer them, but also to try and find out what researchers need to know. And I would say, going into this, that what we need to know is what affects patients' lives most. What should we be working on, particularly if they're things we're not, and what questions or problems you would like to be solved. I think as an example of that, if you do take medications for lipodystrophy, these are often medications that were developed, let's say, for type 2 diabetes in the case of GLP-1 based drugs. Are there things that they don't solve? And that's actually what we want to look at in this grant application that we're submitting this week, but is to try and look, we know a lot about what these drugs do in type 2 diabetes, but we don't really know about the things that they're not solving for people with lipodystrophy. So I think that's a really useful question to be thinking about. To try and temper people's expectations when you give us this information, we will do something with it, we promise, but it's just to try and highlight the challenges for the researchers. So the first thing I think is funding. We need to convince funders that lipodystrophy is really important. The good news is that that's somewhere where we can really get a lot of help from patients and from stakeholder groups and anybody else, because it's hearing your stories that makes us want to do something about it. It also makes it much easier for us to convince funders that they really need to solve these problems and to try and help. So I think that's a really important point to make, is the more patient impact we can demonstrate, then the better chance we have of convincing funders to fund our research. Timescales are always longer than we would like them to be. I mean, just for example, we can spend nearly a year just finding out, from writing a grant to finding out whether we get the money. So, it can take a long time. That's probably at the outside, but usually it's never less than 6 months. The research programs we run tend to be 3 to 5 years long, so often it'll be that long before we've really managed to finish the work, publish the results, and then obviously translating those to therapies. People always used to say, oh, it could be 5 to 10 years or something, but it very much depends. You can imagine if we could demonstrate that a particular drug which is already available would be really useful, then that can be translated really quickly, because we don't have to go through all the kind of licensing. If you want to talk about a brand new therapy because we found a target, getting that all the way to a treatment obviously is a very long process. So, and then finally, I think, we need to know we're answering the right questions, and then hopefully we need to inspire the best students, the best young researchers to keep working on this problem, and that this is what they should be doing, which I think is really good. So hopefully we have some great people at the moment, and hopefully we can keep them engaged. Right, I'm going to stop there. I hope that's okay. I'll probably stop sharing the slides if that's good, but unless someone has questions for the slides, I can always put them back up.